attention to Latin America. In 1954, the CIA topples the non-communist Guatemalan government at the behest of the United Fruit Company. The government simply wasn't pro-business enough, and the United Fruit Company will essentially become the dominant power in Guatemala. This is ruled by corporation through the force of the CIA. Cuba had been ruled by a military dictator named Batista since 1952, and it was super U.S. friendly. This was a great vacation spot for American businessmen, and just really one of America's strongest economic connections. It was controlled by U.S. corporations for all intents and purposes. And there was also a strong American mafia presence down there, which controlled the massive gambling and tourism industry. But this wasn't working out so well for the Cuban people, who were basically being economically oppressed by the American corporations and tourism industry. And in 1957, a communist Cuban named Fidel Castro begins a revolution against Batista. And by January 1st of 1959, Castro seizes control of Cuba. He redistributes the land, and he nationalizes the American industries that are already in Cuba. He takes them away from their American owners. By 1960, Castro is taking Soviet aid, really mostly because he wants to stop America from coming back into Cuba and taking back over. Americans respond by cutting back the favored sugar import status of Cuba. And as Eisenhower leaves office, America cuts off all diplomatic and business relationships with Cuba altogether. This further drives Castro into the Soviet sphere of influence. And of course, this communist government is still in charge in Cuba today. Eisenhower's primary concern, though, was Europe. And in 1956, a Hungarian rebellion against the communists demanding democracy rises up. They believe that Eisenhower will help them. They believe that America will help them against the evil Soviets. But Eisenhower is worried. He's concerned that if we step into Hungary, that this was going to lead to a nuclear war. And so the world watches helplessly by as Soviet tanks roll into Hungary and crush the dissidents, all the while America doing nothing to help them. But this was the reality in a world where both sides had nuclear weapons. And getting into a country like Hungary could lead to a devastating conflict worldwide. In November of 1958, Stalin is dead, and he's replaced by Khrushchev. This is the new leader of the Soviet Union. Khrushchev demands the West leave West Berlin, and we refuse. Khrushchev asked to have home and away visits where he comes to America and then Eisenhower goes to Russia, and then a third meeting in Paris, kind of on neutral territory, with Eisenhower. In 1959, Khrushchev visits the United States, and he actually goes on TV and debates Richard Nixon.
There are some instances where you may be ahead of us. For example, in the development of the thrust of your rockets for the investigation of outer space. There may be some instances, for example, color television, where we're ahead of you. But in order for both of us to benefit, that's all that I can say from the way you talk and the way you dominate the conversation. You would have made a good lawyer yourself.
Everything will be translated into Russian.
Before the Paris meeting, proposed Paris meeting between Eisenhower and Nixon, Khrushchev announces that the Soviets have shot down a U-2 spy plane that had been flying at high altitude over the Soviets and taking pictures. The pilot was captured. Francis Gary Powers is going to be captured, and the meeting falls through. This has become, of course, a major incident in the Cold War, and will ratchet up the tension even higher. 8 years later, through 8 years of presidency, Eisenhower had increased Cold War tension. He did limit the extremists within his own party who wanted an all-out war with the Soviets, but we also have created all kinds of new trouble spots in Vietnam and Cuba. We failed to defend Hungary, and of course the Middle East is threatening to boil over altogether. He had rejected a large conventional army in favor of a massive nuclear force. And in his farewell address, he will warn against the unwarranted influence of the military-industrial complex. Unfortunately, he'll be the last president to show any restraint in this regard.
In the councils of government, we must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence, whether sought or unsought, by the military-industrial complex. The potential for the disastrous rise of misplaced power exists and will persist. We must never let the weight of this combination endanger our liberties or democratic processes. We should take nothing for granted. Only an alert and knowledgeable citizenry can compel the proper meshing of the huge industrial and military machinery of defense with our peaceful methods and goals, so that security and liberty may prosper together.